The biggest news comes from the east. Yesterday, the head of the Wagner group, Prigozhin, announced that his mercenaries started gradually leaving Bakhmut in small groups while the regular Russian army was assuming control over one position after another. A lot of Ukrainian fighters were skeptical at first about the news and anticipated a sudden push towards Josephir. But later, high-ranking Ukrainian officers confirmed that Wagner was leaving. Today, Prigozhin released another video with his visit to one of the bases in the deep rear and reported that most Wagner forces should be able to leave Bakhmut by the 1st of June. But more importantly, he raised the forbidden in the Russian media space subject, which is the extent of losses, and whether the so-called special military operation is a success or a failure. Prigozhin claimed during an interview with Russian political strategist Konstantin Dolgov that at the beginning of the battle for Bakhmut, the Wagner group had 35,000 troops and that shortly after that Prigozhin recruited 50,000 prisoners. So the Wagner group had 85,000 troops at their disposal. Prigozhin claimed that during the 8 months of continuous fighting, 10,000 prisoners and 10,000 full-time professional Wagner fighters were killed in action. This immediately raises suspicions because it implies that the professionals were killed more easily than untrained prisoners who were used in suicidal human wave attacks. Based on Prigozhin's figures, professionals had a 30% death rate while prisoners had a 20% death rate. A former Russian officer, Gherkin, pointed out that only half of the prisoners reportedly received pardons. So it looks like Wagner lost 25,000 prisoners, not 10,000. He also speculated that other losses are 50% higher, meaning that Wagner lost 15,000 full-time professional fighters. The total number of killed in action, therefore, is estimated to be around 40,000 troops. But this is only killed. Many soldiers get wounded. Prigozhin claimed that they had as many wounded as killed, so also 40,000. This makes the total number of losses to be around 80,000. So at the beginning of the battle for Bakhmut, Wagner had 85,000 troops and at the end only 5,000. This means that the Ukrainians have achieved their objective of destroying the most capable elements of the Russian army ahead of the counter-offensive operation. Interestingly, the losses are totally consistent with the changes in the length of the front line. Under the responsibility in midwinter, Wagners were responsible for 85 kilometers of the front, while during the last month they were responsible for less than 5 kilometers of the front. That is why Prigozhin wants to get his forces out of the combat zone for a few months. This way he can at least wait until the wounded heal and return to the ranks. Most people understand that official losses are always understated. So when Prigozhin made official numbers so high, a former Russian officer, Gherkin, immediately told Prigozhin to keep his mouth shut and stop talking about wild losses for a very insignificant result. Unfortunately for Russians, Prigozhin also went in full depth discussing the insignificance of the results. He said that the whole special military operation was a complete failure because Russians achieved completely opposite results to the stated objectives. When it comes to the goal of the notification, first of all, he said that they fought with tens of thousands of soldiers and are still in search of Nazis. And secondly, the war has catalyzed and solidified Ukrainian national identity and also legitimized Ukrainians as a nation internationally because everyone around the world is discussing the war in Ukraine. When it comes to the goal of demilitarization, Ukraine's armed forces increased from about 250,000 personnel before the war to 700,000 personnel today. And Ukrainian forces are now equipped with advanced Western anti-tank ground missiles, precision artillery, long-range missiles, modern tanks and other systems that Ukraine did not have before Russia's invasion. Prigozhin said that now Ukraine has one of the most powerful armies in the world. He specified that Ukrainians had developed the highest level of organization, highest level of preparation, highest level of reconnaissance, and that they could fight with anything from old Soviet weapons to the most modern ones produced and supplied by the Western allies. The US is already ramping up its production, and the European countries are restored in their military-industrial complex. The war between Ukraine and Russia radically changed the security needs and elements in Eastern Europe for a long time. Neutral Finland and Sweden had to take drastic measures in the face of Russia's aggression. This situation led the two countries to become members of NATO. Despite Finland joining the alliance, Sweden is still pending with Finland's NATO membership. Last week, tensions rose in the Baltic and Nordic regions. In the face of this move, the Russian army immediately carried out a comprehensive navy drill in the Baltic, and at the same time, the tension was taken to the next level when the Russian ambassador in Sweden announced that the Scandinavian countries had now become Russia's legitimate targets. A critical response from Sweden to this move of Russia came without delay. The reckless statements of Russia lost their effect with the warnings of Sweden. Let's take a closer look at the developments that increased the tension between Sweden and Russia when Finland and Sweden applied for NATO membership last spring. Russia's reaction was negative, but quiet. Vladimir Putin's reaction consisted only of words, not actions. With Finland's acceptance of NATO membership, Russia's northwest flank became a NATO border. This will increase even more when Sweden joins the alliance. Fearing this possibility, Russia hardened its style even more. Sweden's Russian ambassador, Viktor Tatarintsev, made statements on the embassy's website. Viktor Tatarintsev noted that joining NATO makes the Scandinavian countries a legitimate target for Russian retaliatory measures, including military ones. In addition, the Russian embassy accused Sweden of becoming an American colony and criticized the country's support for Ukraine. The Russian embassy also claimed to have received an increasing number of letters from Swedes supporting Russia, but refused to publish them. Already, Russia had long threatened Sweden with appropriate military technical measures if it tried to join NATO. The threats of the Russian ambassador, on the other hand, almost bumped into Sweden's harsh warnings. The Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs is summoning the Russian ambassador to protest the blatant attempt to interfere. Swedish Foreign Minister Tobias Billström reported that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs will summon the Russian ambassador to make a clear statement against this obvious attempt to influence. Billström said Sweden sets Sweden's security policy. No one else does. For now, it's not possible to predict how the tension between Russia and Sweden will end. New developments in the future will enable us to comment more clearly. Now let's broaden our perspective a little more and consider Sweden's support for Ukraine. Since the beginning of the war, Sweden has provided critical military aid to Ukraine. It provided long-range anti-tank missiles, RBS, 15 coastal defense systems, long-range Archer howitzers, light tanks, millions of military ammunition and equipment to the Ukrainian army. Sweden has also several times increased its military ammunition production capacity for Ukraine. In January, the Swedish administration, one of the supporters of Kiev, announced its huge military aid that will create an event on the world agenda. The striking news has been one of the most effective steps to be taken for Ukraine at the moment. Sweden has approved the delivery of Archer 155mm squared self-propelled howitzers to Ukraine, according to Swedish Foreign Minister Tobias Billström. Ukraine should acquire as many assault weapons as possible to attack Russian troops, and Sweden should do its part. However, in line with this statement, the Swedish government did not share with the media the exact number of Archer's self-propelled guns transferred to Ukraine. According to the same reports, it's estimated that 18 self-propelled artillery mounts of this type will be delivered to Ukraine in the first shipment. When used with several self-propelled gun crews, these artillery installations can offer a highly effective offensive potential of up to 12 155mm squared caliber shells due to their high rate of fire. The timing of the supply of such weapons to Ukraine is unknown, however, given Sweden's previous statements of intent to supply arms to Ukraine and the timing of deliveries. The transfer of these Archer self-propelled guns is likely to take place very soon. The Stockholm administration also announced that it will send 50 CV-90 armored vehicles and law-portable anti-tank missiles to the Ukrainian armed forces. Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson announced that Sweden will send CV-90 infantry fighting vehicles, Archer artillery systems, and low anti-tank missiles to Ukraine. Speaking at a press conference, the Prime Minister stated that his government has argued on a three-part military support package for Ukraine, including the first decision to start the delivery of artillery system Archer to Ukraine. Earlier, Sweden announced its plans to send the ingeniously developed Archer artillery system to Ukraine, but the information about the CV-90 combat vehicles came as a surprise to everyone. At the same time, according to Swedish Defense Minister Paul Johnson, the government aims to hand over all weapons and provide training for the Ukrainian army in the next few months. Sweden's aid to Ukraine is enough to anger the Russian leader. Russia has announced that it will make military reinforcements near Sweden and Finland, both in response to this act of cooperation between Sweden and Ukraine and against the risk of Sweden joining NATO. Also, given the continuing need to focus on the war against Ukraine, Moscow has now relied on gray zone tactics to undermine NATO's position in the region. As it is known, explosions in the Nord Stream submarine pipelines in the Baltic Sea in September 2022 caused heavy damage and initiated separate investigations in 3 different countries. Pipelines connect Russia and Germany. The incident, which Swedish authorities had previously confirmed to be an act of deliberate sabotage, spawned several theories regarding the identity and affiliation of the alleged criminals who were allegedly involved by a pro-Russian US and pro-Ukrainian group. The Kremlin, the White House, and the Ukrainian government vehemently denied involvement. Mats Lindqvist, the prosecutor who led the Swedish investigation, said these speculations have no bearing on the ongoing investigation, which is based on facts and information emerging from analysis, crime scene investigations, and collaboration with authorities in Sweden and other countries. Sweden is investigating after 2 of the gas leaks occurred in waters within its exclusive economic zone. Sweden's insistence on NATO, Russia's threats, and the Ukraine war continue at full speed. So what can NATO do in this situation? NATO's new enlargement creates the need to manage both the short-term and long-term evolution of the Russian threat. In the short term, NATO should plan to increase defense and resilience against hybrid threats. NATO may want to further demonstrate its willingness to respond proportionately to hybrid attacks attributable to Russia in response to Russia's growing nuclear threat. NATO should review its nuclear stance, including expanded deterrence and the role of nuclear weapons in escalation management and war preparations in nuclear fallout-affected environments. The alliance should also plan to control the conventional threat posed by a resurgent Russia in the Scandinavian Baltic theater without taking unduly provocative steps. The integration of highly capable Swedish and Finnish armies into NATO will bolster the alliance's regional deterrence stance, but more can be done. This should include changing the alliance's command structure, reviewing the contingency plan in the region, improving the Swedish and Finnish reinforcement infrastructure, holding new large-scale exercises in Northern Europe, and developing capabilities such as air and missile defense and intelligence in the High North. The accession of Finland and Sweden could significantly increase regional stability. Still, the alliance cannot ignore the risks that come with it. These steps will help ensure that NATO is ready for any response Russia has in mind. We'll have to wait and see how the Scandinavian countries' accession to NATO will affect the Ukraine war. How about looking for the answer to a big question? What is a dictator's worst nightmare? Is it the press? Dictators often buy media companies and create fear in the press by arresting journalists. This leads to the disappearance of unbiased media outlets in a short period of time. Dictators only fear the press in the early stages of their rule, but later on they manage to take over the press judiciary. No, because dictators also have great influence over the courts. No court in a dictator's country is independent, and these courts can never rule against a dictator. Opposition politicians. Dictators often accuse their opponents of treason and imprisoned or exiled them. In addition, dictatorial regimes generate great anger against politicians who criticize the leader. It is impossible for democratic politicians to challenge dictators. What, then, is a dictator's nightmare? A people on their feet. Dictators can be protested against by citizens who do not believe them, despite all the propaganda. These protests completely discredit the dictator. Soon, all the dictator's mistakes become the talk of the country. As a result of the uprisings, the government falls. Russian President Putin is now living the worst nightmare in history. The Russian people have revolted against Putin's repressive policies. The Kremlin leadership can do nothing in the face of these uprisings. There are dozens of reasons for citizens to revolt in Russia. First of all, the long-standing economic crisis was one of the reasons for these uprisings. But after Putin's decision to attack Ukraine, millions of people in Russia revolted. Russian citizens are completely fed up with Putin's occupying policies. Nobody wants war anymore, but Putin needed this war to increase his political power. He thought that if the country went to war, he would be able to suppress the opposition more easily. But things did not go Putin's way. Thousands of Russians gathered in Moscow Square after Putin decided to invite Russia. These citizens felt that Putin should not have started the invasion. They met with dozens of Kremlin officials, but the situation did not change. Putin was very determined to invade Ukraine. The Ukrainian army developed an incredible defense against Russia. As a result, the Russian army suffered a heavy defeat. According to the Ukrainian army, about 150,000 Russian soldiers have been killed since the beginning of the war. The death toll in the Russian army continues to increase every day. Russian citizens blame Putin for so many deaths because everyone knows that this war was not fought for the Russian people. With such an increase in the death toll, almost everyone in Russia has a friend and relative who died in this war. This makes the Russian people even more angry. On the other hand, when more soldiers die, it is claimed that Putin will announce a new mobilization order to improve the army. As you know, Russia was in chaos after Putin's mobilization order. Russian citizens did not want 300,000 more people to be recruited into the army. Protests in Moscow Square continued for days. It is claimed that Putin is now preparing another mobilization decision in which 500,000 soldiers will be called to the army. Russian citizens are very worried about this. Thousands of Russian citizens will protest this decision in order to prevent this. Putin has called his military troops to Moscow. These troops will detain the protesters and send them to court to be tried for treason. But even this is not enough to scare Russian citizens. The anti-war protests in Russia are very brave. This revolt of the people worries Putin very much. Putin claims that the Russian people support this war, but service in Russia show that Putin is no longer supported by the people. Dozens of articles are published every day about this. Moreover, Russian protesters are not only organizing anti-war demonstrations, they are also rebelling against all of Putin's repressive policies and mistakes. Even if Putin withdraws from this war today, the Russian people will continue to hate it. This reaction of the Russian people is also affecting the course of the war. Putin is hesitating to make big moves in the war to prevent the protests from getting bigger. Thanks to these protests, the Russian people are making a great contribution to Ukraine's freedom and independence. The protests in Russia are not only streets protests. Very influential people from different parts of the world are joining the protests, calling on Putin. Many non-governmental organizations are emphasizing that this war must end as soon as possible. These calls are being heard all over the world. Russian people also tried another interesting method of rebellion. Millions of citizens signed the texts of rebellion, uploaded on a website in a short time. This event proved how big the reaction against Putin is. On the other hand, world-famous artists and athletes are also calling for an end to this war. This is leading to a rapid decline in Putin's popular support. Putin is becoming completely isolated in every field. But what scares Putin the most is that the commanders are against the war. Most of the Russian commanders disagree with Putin on this war. They blame Putin for all the failures in the war. Putin is trying to convince the commanders, but many commanders want this war to end as soon as possible. This opinion of the commanders has been leaked to the press in Russia many times before. This situation is also being followed by Russian rebels. The rebels are calling on the commanders to stop Putin as soon as possible. As a result of the tension between Russian commanders and Putin, there may be a military coup in Russia. As the popular revolts increase, the possibility of a coup is also increasing. The news on the subject has started to increase in the Russian press. Putin dismissed many commanders for this reason, but it is known that many commanders in the army are still against Putin. Putin is afraid to dismiss these commanders. Russian citizens are carefully watching Putin's moves. Tension in the country is at its highest level. Russian rebels are trying to end Putin's political career as soon as possible. Putin, on the other hand, continues to use violence against the protesters to suppress the riots. The outcome of the struggle between the rebels and Putin will affect the war in Ukraine and the history of the whole world. If the rebels succeed, Putin's government may be forced to resign. This could start a process leading to the breakup of Russia. There are 22 republics in the Russian Federation. The rebellions in these regions are growing every day. In the event of a major government crisis in Russia, this state will start to fight for independence, especially in countries such as Chechnya, Dagestan, and Bashkortostan. Rebellions are expected to grow very rapidly. The disintegration of Russia could change political balances all over the world since the early 20th century. There has been a rivalry between the Eastern and Western blocs all over the world. That's why the risk of the nuclear war has increased at times. But if Russia collapses, there will be no major military power in the world except NATO. This will affect the outcome of the conflicts in every region of the world. The wars in Syria, Iraq, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and other countries could come to an end. World history could experience a major turning point. Russian rebels are about to establish peace all over the world. What do you think about the major uprisings in Russia, and how do you think they are changing the course of the war? Do you think Putin will resign as a result of these uprisings? Do you think there will be a coup in Russia?